Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on a story that really kind of blends this cutting-edge science with a very personal journey. We're talking about the world's first IVF baby, Louise Joy Brown.
Really a fascinating intersection of human determination and scientific innovation, but also all of the ethical complexities that come along with these huge breakthroughs.
Yeah, no doubt. This story starts with the young scientist Robert Edwards, back in 1953 at Edinburgh University.
Mm-hmm.
Not your typical research lab, though. This guy is studying mouse reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
And get this, he invites his date, Ruth Fowler, to see his work. They actually snuck into the lab late at night, surrounded by literally hundreds of mice.
Oh, wow. What a first date, right?
Yeah, you can say that again. It's kind of funny, though, because this anecdote really foreshadows Edwards' whole unconventional path in science.
Yeah.
That mouse house, as they called it, became a pretty significant place for them, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, I love that. And from these humble beginnings, Edwards' research would lead to just a revolution in reproductive medicine. It didn't start with IVF, though, did it? You're right. Initially, Edwards was studying mouse reproduction to figure out how to prevent pregnancy.
Okay, so family planning.
Exactly. His early research was all about contraception, which was a big issue in the post-war era.
Right. So what made him switch from preventing pregnancy to enabling it?
I think it was a few things. He saw firsthand the heartache of couples who couldn't have children, and he realized his research might be able to help them. Edwards became really driven by this idea of making parenthood possible, especially for those who thought it could never happen.
Makes sense. And that's where he got the idea for IVF, fertilizing those eggs in the lab and then implanting them right into the uterus.
That's it. But it was totally radical back then. You can imagine the pushback he got. Some people thought it was like science fiction. Others worried about the ethics, playing God and all that.
It must have been a tough road to go down, pursuing research that controversial.
It definitely was. He wasn't getting a lot of support from the scientific community. Funding was tight. And the ethical debates were just getting started. But Edwards was determined. He moved to Cambridge University to keep going with his work.
So he just kept pushing forward. Amazing. What was the next big step in his research?
So for IVF to really work, Edwards knew he needed this very specific surgical technique. It's called laparoscopy. And that's where Patrick Steptoe comes in.
Okay.
Steptoe was this amazing gynecologist, a pioneer of laparoscopy. It was way less invasive than other surgical methods at the time.
So much less risky.
Exactly.
So how did Edwards and Steptoe end up working together?
Edwards saw how laparoscopy could be a game changer for IVF and reached out to Steptoe.
Smart.
They teamed up, which was a big turning point in the whole IVF story.
I can see why. The scientist focused on fertilization and the surgeon with this groundbreaking, less invasive technique. It seems like a perfect match.
Totally. They started working together, testing their theories on mice, refining their techniques, and of course dealing with the ethical debates swirling around them.
I can only imagine. I'm curious, what were the main criticisms of laparoscopy back then?
Well, it was pretty new, so like anything new in medicine, people were skeptical. Some doctors didn't think it was safe or effective enough. They were worried about using it for something as delicate as IVF. But Edwards, he was always pushing the boundaries of science. He really championed Steptoe's work.
Interesting.
Yeah, he saw laparoscopy as absolutely essential to their mission.
So they kept at it, even with all the skepticism surrounding IVF and laparoscopy.
Oh yeah, they were really dedicated.
Can you talk a little bit more about their collaboration? How did it all actually progress?
Their partnership was incredible. They had this shared vision, this drive to make IVF a reality. They were spending hours in the lab refining their techniques, looking at the data, overcoming setback after setback.
Wow.
They even published their findings, which slowly started to get people in the scientific community to take their work more seriously.
It was all happening while this huge ethical debate raged on around them.
Yeah.
It must have been a tough time.
Absolutely. But they were so committed, they truly believe IVF could change lives. And that belief fueled them. They weren't just curious. It was about helping couples have families. It was a long road, though. Lots of challenges. Funding was really hard to come by, and they often had to work in their spare time. There were so many setbacks along the way.
I bet. Can you tell us about some of those challenges, like during the clinical trials?
One case in particular really stands out. They actually achieved an IVF pregnancy, but tragically it was ectopic.
Oh, no.
The fetus developed outside the uterus. A devastating complication.
I can't even imagine how hard that must have been for everyone.
It was a huge blow for sure. But you know what? It didn't stop them. It really shows how committed they were to their mission and how much empathy they had for the patients they were working with.
Yeah, that's true. It's pretty inspiring, and they didn't just give up. So let's talk about Leslie Brown, the woman who became the first IVF mother. What was her story?
Leslie had been trying to get pregnant for 9 years. She had blocked fallopian tubes. IVF was like her very last hope.
Wow, 9 years. That's a long time.
It is.
What was it like for her to actually decide to be part of that trial?
It must have been such a mix of emotions. On the one hand, there's this incredible hope, but also so much uncertainty. I mean, after years of disappointment, to have this chance, no matter how small, it had to be both exciting and terrifying. It took a lot of courage for her to go through with it.
For sure. And her courage, along with the dedication of Edwards and Steptoe and their research assistant, Jean Purdy, really changed everything.
Absolutely. And then finally, on July 25, 1978, at Oldham General Hospital, Louise Joy Brown was born the world's first IVF baby.
What a moment. What was the reaction like?
Oh, it was a complete media frenzy. The world was captivated by this test tube baby, as they called her. But in the middle of all the chaos, Edwards and Steptoe made a very deliberate choice.
What was that?
They didn't try to cash in on the publicity. They could have become huge celebrities overnight, but instead they just stayed focused on their mission to help more couples become parents.
That says a lot about them. So what happened after Louise was born?
They created the Bourne Hall Clinic, a whole facility dedicated to IVF treatment. It was a groundbreaking move that made this incredible technology available to so many more people.
And from there, IVF just took off, right? What kind of impact did it have?
It was huge. First, all over Britain, and then the whole world IVF clinics started opening up. And now think about it. Millions of babies are alive today because of this technology.
It's really mind-blowing when you think about the impact of that one little baby girl born back in 1978.
I know, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a scientific achievement either. IVF changed society in a big way.
How so?
It challenged all these ideas we had about family and parenthood and even what life really means. It started all these conversations about ethics and religion and the limits of science.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Did it affect anything else outside of medicine?
Oh, yeah, definitely. IVF's influence is everywhere. Look at art literature, even legal battles over who's the parent. It really shows you how much scientific progress can change things, not just individual lives, but our whole society.
So we touched on the ethical concerns earlier.
Right.
What are some of the big questions people are still talking about with IVF today?
A big one is what happens to all the embryos that aren't used. See, in IVF, you often create multiple embryos, but not all of them get implanted.
Right. And that leads to all sorts of questions about what those embryos actually are and what should happen to them.
Exactly. It's a tough issue. No easy answers.
What other ethical issues are there?
Well, access to treatment is a big one. IVF is expensive, so that raises questions about fairness and who gets to benefit from it. Not everyone has the same opportunities, which brings in all these social and economic problems.
It's complicated.
It is. And then there's this whole debate about genetic screening. With IVF, you can do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which means you can check for certain genetic disorders.
Right.
And that brings up all these questions about what makes a treat desirable and whether it could lead to discrimination.
That's definitely a conversation that's been going on for a long time and will probably keep going.
Yeah. And these debates are only going to get more intense as IVF keeps developing. It's a good reminder that scientific advances don't happen in a bubble. They come with big ethical and social implications that we need to think hard about.
Absolutely. But even with all that at the heart of IVF is this basic idea of helping people build families.
Yeah. It's all about that human desire to be parents and the hope that science can make it happen.
So we've talked about how IVF was developed, the birth of Louise Brown, and the wider impact it had on society. But what about Edwards and Steptoe? Did they get the recognition they deserved for this amazing work?
They did, but it took a while. At first, the scientific community didn't really accept them, mostly because of all the controversy around IVF.
Really? That's surprising considering how normal it is now.
I know. But back then, they were seen as these rebels pushing the limits of what was acceptable in medicine. Some people thought they were way out there.
So how did they finally get recognized?
It took time for people to come around and to see the real impact of their work. Sadly, Steptoe passed away in 1988. But Robert Edwards finally won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2010.
Wow, he had to wait a long time.
He did. The Nobel Committee said his work led to a new and important field of medicine.
It's amazing that something so controversial back then is now celebrated as one of the greatest achievements in science.
It really is. And they continue to inspire scientists and doctors everywhere.
What a story. From late nights in that mouse house to a Nobel Prize and millions of babies born around the world. The IVF journey is really about human ingenuity and perseverance and the incredible power of scientific discovery.
You said it. And the journey is far from over. As technology keeps advancing, we're going to face new ethical challenges and new questions about how it's affecting society. But one thing will always be true: that deep desire to be parents and the hope that science can help people have the families they dream of. It's amazing to think about, isn't it? Over 10 million babies born through IVF. It's become so commonplace now, almost routine in a way. But each one of those births is a victory over infertility. It shows just how powerful this technology really is.
You're so right. And as IVF has become more common, it's also changed our culture and society in big ways. We're seeing new types of families, more awareness about infertility, and people are more open to talking about their reproductive choices.
Exactly. IVF has changed how we think about family and parenthood in ways we couldn't have imagined a few decades ago. It's opened up so many possibilities for same-sex couples, for single parents, for people struggling with age-related infertility.
And it's led to these really important discussions about whether people have the right to choose when and how they have children, regardless of biology.
Absolutely. IVF has empowered people to make choices about their reproductive lives without being limited by those biological constraints.
It's incredible how one scientific discovery can have such a huge ripple effect, not just changing individual lives, but transforming our entire society.
It really shows how science, culture, and human experience are all connected. And it highlights how important it is to think about the ethical side of things as we explore all the possibilities that these advances create.
Speaking of ethics, we've talked about some of the complex debates surrounding IVF. It's clear this technology raises some really big questions about the beginning of life, the role of science, and the potential for both good and harm.
It definitely does. And as IVF technology keeps developing, these ethical dilemmas are only going to get tougher. For example, those advancements in genetic screening bring up some questions about what makes a trait desirable and how we prevent discrimination.
It's a tough one. Where do we draw the line between using technology to stop diseases and using it to create so-called designer babies?
That's the question. And as we explore genetic manipulation even further, we need to have open and honest discussions about the ethics of it all.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. It's not just about the science behind IVF, but the human stories, the ethical challenges, and how it's impacted society. It reminds us that scientific progress isn't just about cold, hard facts. It's about our values, our choices, and what it means to be human.
I couldn't agree more. And as we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with this thought. The story of IVF isn't over. It's still being written. As technology moves forward, we'll have to face new ethical questions and new questions about its impact on society. But one thing will always remain: that deep desire to be a parent and the hope that science can help make those dreams a reality.
That's a great point to end on. It reminds us that the IVF journey, just like the journey of parenthood, is full of ups and downs and challenges. But ultimately, it has the potential for so much joy and fulfillment. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the fascinating world of IVF. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our podcast for more explorations of groundbreaking scientific advancements. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and remember to always stay curious.